I have seen cities brought to their knees by bombs. I have seen capitals freeze under sanctions, coups, and civil war. But I have rarely seen anything as revealing as this: a nuclear-armed superpower, paralyzed by snow. Not an invading army, not NATO, not even Ukraine's missiles. Snow. So let me ask the question no one in the Kremlin wants asked. If a few centimeters of frozen water can shut down your capital, what exactly is holding your state together? Is it strength? Or is it habit? Is it power? Or just momentum that hasn't yet run out? Because what unfolded in Moscow in mid-January was not a weather story. It was an X-ray. And the image was ugly. On the night of January 9th into the 10th, Moscow was hit by one of its heaviest snowfalls in roughly half a century, according to reported meteorological data. Nothing unprecedented for Russia, nothing unimaginable, nothing a country that prides itself on conquering nature should find shocking. And yet, within hours, the capital of a country that claims global relevance simply stopped functioning. Airports collapsed first. All four major Moscow airports, Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, Vnukovo, Zhukovsky, ground to a halt. Flights canceled, delayed, diverted. Runways clogged, aircraft frozen in place. The gateways between Russia and the rest of the world slammed shut like rusted doors. This was not a temporary inconvenience, it was a systemic failure unfolding in real time. Inside the terminals, scenes emerged that looked less like an international hub and more like an emergency shelter after a natural disaster. Thousands of passengers stranded, families sleeping on concrete floors, children crying, elderly travelers without access to medication. No clear instructions, no food distribution, minimal water. Information rationed like a scarce resource. And this is where the illusion began to crack. Because this was not a remote regional airport, this was Moscow. The heart of the system, the showcase city, the place the Kremlin always protects first. If the center cannot cope, what does that say about the periphery? Russian officials, as expected, blamed the weather. Heavy snowfall, unfavorable conditions, an act of nature. But critics argue that weather does not create crises on its own. Weather only exposes them. Snow does not cancel hundreds of flights by itself. Snow does not erase contingency planning. Snow does not remove spare parts from warehouses, trained staff from control rooms, or functioning equipment from runways. Those things disappear for other reasons. Years of underinvestment in civilian infrastructure, aviation fleets aging beyond safe margins, maintenance deferred because sanctioned spare parts are unavailable, ground equipment outdated, cannibalized, or broken beyond repair. And above all, a state whose attention and budget has been permanently diverted elsewhere. To war. Now, let's talk about the real protagonists of this story. On one side, you have the Russian state under Vladimir Putin, a system built on a simple promise: give up political choice, and you will get stability. No chaos, no uncertainty, no shocks. That was the deal. That was the justification for authoritarian rule. On the other side, you have ordinary civilians, passengers, workers, families who believe that whatever else was happening in Ukraine, Moscow would remain insulated, protected, functional. That belief died on airport floors. Because when the snow fell, the state did not respond like a confident power. It responded like an overstretched bureaucracy pretending everything was normal. Airport management appeared overwhelmed. Security presence thinned. Hygiene collapsed. Trash piled up. Passengers reportedly received a small cup of water every few hours, if they were lucky. No blankets, no proper shelter, no clear timeline. And the anger was immediate. People shouted at staff who had no answers. Others recorded videos not out of malice, but disbelief. "This is Moscow," they kept saying. Moscow. That phrase mattered, because this was supposed to be the exception, the proof that the system still worked. Outside, the situation looked no better. Aircraft sat immobilized in thick snowdrifts. Ground crews, locking functional snow-clearing vehicles, resorted to manual labor, shovels against a blizzard. Planes waited so long that, according to multiple reports, fuel margins became a concern. Cabins grew colder. Ventilation systems strained or failed. And hovering over all of this was another layer of paralysis, airspace closures triggered by drone alerts. Ukraine's drone strategy, cheap, mass-produced, strategically deployed, has forced Russia to repeatedly shut down civilian airspace around Moscow, sometimes over confirmed threats, sometimes over suspected ones. Either way, the result is the same: flights circling until fuel runs low, then diverting or canceling altogether. From a military standpoint, this may be rational: protect strategic assets, shield the capital. But from a civilian standpoint, it is devastating, because it means civilian life is now officially subordinate to military anxiety. And that is a line once crossed, rarely uncrossed. So who is responsible? Not the snow, not the passengers, not the exhausted ground crews. Responsibility lies with a system that has concentrated power so tightly at the top that flexibility has disappeared. A system where regional managers wait for orders instead of acting, where budgets flow upward to the war machine while municipal services survive on scraps, where competence is less rewarded than loyalty. The people suffering on those floors did not choose this trade-off. They were not consulted when civilian resilience was sacrificed for military ambition. Yet they are paying the price. This is the real opposition in today's Russia. Not political parties, not dissidents on paper, but reality itself. Reality versus rhetoric. Infrastructure versus propaganda. Human needs versus imperial fantasy. And reality, unlike dissent, cannot be arrested. What happened in Moscow was not an accident. It was not bad luck. It was the predictable outcome of priorities made visible. Snow didn't defeat Moscow. The system did. And once people see that, once they feel it in their bones on cold concrete floors, the damage is no longer logistical. It becomes psychological. Because the most dangerous moment for any authoritarian system is not when it faces enemies abroad, but when its own citizens quietly realize, if this can happen here, it can happen anywhere. The collapse at Moscow's airports was not a single failure. It was a cascade. One weakness triggered another, until the entire system folded in on itself. This is how complex systems fail, not with a bang, but with overlap. Snow meets neglect. Neglect meets sanctions. Sanctions meet war. War meets drones. And suddenly, a global aviation hub is reduced to inflatable mattresses and unanswered questions. Let's break down the mechanics of that collapse. First, aviation paralysis. According to multiple reports circulating in Russian media and industry channels, more than 300 flights across the country were affected within days. Dozens canceled outright, hundreds delayed. Moscow alone handles roughly 40% of Russia's total air traffic. So when Moscow stops, Russia doesn't slow down. Russia chokes. Airlines bleed money immediately. Analysts estimate that carriers lose up to 30% of daily revenue during full shutdowns. Each diverted aircraft reportedly adds millions of rubles in unplanned fuel, ground services, and crew costs. Multiply that by hundreds of flights, and the numbers stop being abstract very quickly. Shares of Aeroflot, Russia's flagship airline, reportedly dropped around 5% in the immediate aftermath. Market reactions are rarely emotional. They are calculations. And the calculation here was simple. This is not a one-off risk. Then there's the baggage. Thousands of suitcases stranded, lost, delayed, abandoned in corridors like archaeological remains of a system that stopped mid-motion. Airlines were forced to hire trucks to deliver luggage to passengers' homes, a logistical nightmare and a financial sinkhole. Every canceled flight represents a direct loss. For a single narrow-body aircraft, that loss can range into tens of millions of rubles depending on route and load. According to industry estimates, total damage to Russia's airline sector over just 2 days reached tens of billions of rubles. And that's before compensation claims, hotel vouchers, meal requirements, legal disputes, and regulatory penalties are even counted. This is not turbulence. This is hemorrhaging. But numbers alone don't capture the full impact. Because behind every canceled flight is a human story. And in this crisis, those stories stacked on top of each other like bodies after a stampede. Families slept on floors under fluorescent lights that never turned off. Children cried from exhaustion, hunger, and confusion. Elderly passengers rationed medication, unsure how long they would be stuck. Some passengers were trapped inside aircraft cabins for hours, engines off, heating failing, waiting for instructions that never came. Others wandered terminals searching for staff who themselves had no information. Trash overflowed, bathrooms became unusable, basic hygiene collapsed. This wasn't discomfort, it was degradation. And what made it worse was the silence. No clear announcements, no timelines, no accountability. Just the quiet realization spreading through the crowd. The system does not know how to fix this. That realization is corrosive. Outside the terminals, Moscow's streets told the same story. Snow removal crews appeared, but often without coordination. Videos circulated showing snow pushed from main roads onto side streets, not cleared, just displaced. Traffic jams stretched for hours. Deliveries failed, meetings canceled, productivity evaporated. In some neighborhoods, residents piled snow in front of government buildings, blocking entrances in symbolic protest. In others, municipal workers stood idle, shovels in hand, waiting for orders that never came. It looked less like a modern capital and more like bureaucratic theater. Lots of people, lots of uniforms, zero results. According to posts widely shared on Russian social media, much of Moscow's snow-clearing workforce consists of migrant laborers from Central Asia. Many reportedly fled due to harsh conditions. Others simply refused to work without adequate pay or equipment. One viral clip captured a man shouting in frustration, asking where the foreign workers were. The comment was crude, but revealing. Because it exposed a structural dependency Russia rarely acknowledges. Critical infrastructure relies on low-wage, disposable labor. When that labor disappears, the facade collapses. And then there is the drone factor. Ukraine's use of low-cost drones has introduced a new form of strategic pressure, one that doesn't aim to destroy infrastructure, but to paralyze it. A suspected drone sighting over Moscow can trigger immediate airspace closures. Civilian flights are halted. Aircraft circle, burn fuel, divert, or land far from their destinations. A drone costing a few $1,000s can immobilize aviation infrastructure worth billions. This is asymmetry in its purest form. Russia's air defense systems are heavily concentrated around military assets and the Kremlin itself. Civilian corridors are secondary, and when the choice is made, civilian life loses. Passengers pay the price for strategic fear. And people notice. They ask uncomfortable questions. If the state cannot guarantee safe civilian airspace in its own capital, what exactly is it guaranteeing? Now zoom out. The aviation sector in Russia was already under strain. The average age of aircraft is high. Spare parts are scarce due to sanctions. Maintenance schedules are stretched. Safety margins shrink quietly, invisibly, until something breaks. There is no money left for modern snow-clearing systems, no budget for rapid response logistics, no redundancy. Everything has been optimized for one priority. Yeah. And that choice has consequences. Moscow produces roughly 20% of Russia's GDP. It is the financial, administrative, and logistical heart of the country. Air traffic is the bloodstream of that organism. When flights stop, contracts stall. Tourism collapses, hotels empty, restaurants suffer. Air cargo delays disrupt already fragile supply chains, electronics, pharmaceuticals, industrial components. Economists estimate that even short-term shutdowns can add inflationary pressure and shave significant percentages off quarterly growth. Daily GDP losses in Moscow alone can reach tens of billions of rubles during full paralysis. This is not sustainable. For a country spanning 11 time zones, civil aviation is not a luxury. It is a necessity of governance. Without planes, the center cannot effectively control the periphery. Governors cannot travel. Officials cannot inspect. Resources cannot move fast enough. The vertical of power, Putin's core governing concept, depends on speed. Orders flow down. Reports flow up. When that circulation slows, authority weakens. And when authority weakens, regions adapt independently. Local solutions replace central directives. coordination fractures. That is how federal integrity erodes, not overnight, but through logistical decay. What we saw in Moscow was not just a snowstorm crisis. It was the human cost of strategic overextension. Passengers sleeping on airport floors were not collateral damage. They were indicators. Indicators that the social contract has been breached, that stability is no longer guaranteed, that obedience no longer buys protection. When citizens experience failure, not in theory, not on television, but physically, the psychological shift is profound. Trust does not collapse loudly. It leaks away. And once people stop believing the system can protect them in peacetime, they begin to question why they should sacrifice for it in wartime. That is the danger Moscow revealed. Not rebellion, not revolution, but doubt. And doubt is far harder to suppress than dissent. There is one final layer to this collapse that cannot be measured in canceled flights or lost revenue. It is technological, it is political, and it is deeply symbolic. Because what froze in Moscow was not just aviation, it was the future Russia thought it had secured. For years, the Kremlin insisted that sanctions would not matter, that Russia would adapt, that import substitution would replace Western technology with domestic production or friendly alternatives. Reality, as always, arrived quietly, and in winter. Reports and videos began circulating of Chinese-made vehicles, promoted as replacements for banned Western brands, failing spectacularly in sub-zero temperatures. Door locks frozen solid, touchscreens unresponsive, electronic systems shutting down entirely. Drivers stranded, cars immobilized, promises exposed. These weren't luxury failures. These were basic functions collapsing under conditions Russian winters have delivered for centuries. This is what technological isolation looks like when tested by climate rather than propaganda. Russia did not replace Western systems, it downgraded them. And dependency did not disappear, it simply changed direction. From Berlin to Beijing. But Chinese manufacturing priorities were never aligned with Russian realities, not climatically, not operationally, not strategically. What worked in marketing decks failed on icy streets. And that failure carries meaning far beyond automobiles. It tells citizens something the state does not want them to conclude. Russia is no longer choosing its tools. It is accepting what it can get. That is not sovereignty. That is constraint. Meanwhile, inside the Kremlin, the rhetoric remains unchanged. Officials speak of industrial growth, of national projects, of economic transformation, of resilience. Putin appears on screen discussing development plans, dozens, they claim, hundreds of initiatives, future-oriented language. But outside, the cameras tell a different story. Runways blocked, roads gridlocked, people freezing. The disconnect between narrative and lived reality has grown too wide to ignore. And that is where this crisis stops being logistical and becomes political. Because for over 2 decades, Putin's legitimacy has rested on a single argument. I may not give you freedom, but I will give you order. No chaos of the 1990s, no collapse, no humiliation. That bargain is now broken. When tens of thousands of people sleep on airport floors in the capital, order is no longer credible. When basic services fail, stability becomes a slogan rather than an experience. The illusion that war could be fought over there while normal life continued over here has shattered. And once illusions break, they do not quietly reassemble. This is why the Moscow airport collapse matters far beyond January, because it signals a transition. From controlled authoritarianism to unmanaged strain. From centralized competence to centralized overload. From strength projected to weakness revealed. The state has made a choice. It has prioritized military expenditure over civilian resilience, expansion over maintenance, glory over governance. And systems built on that choice do not fail dramatically at first. They fray. They lag. They miss deadlines. They stop answering questions. Until one night, snow falls. and everything comes apart at once. There is also a strategic dimension that cannot be ignored. Ukraine's use of cheap drones to disrupt Russian airspace represents a new era of warfare, one where civilian infrastructure becomes the pressure point. Not destroyed, just destabilized. No spectacular explosions, no dramatic footage. Just delay, uncertainty, paralysis. A handful of drones, costing a fraction of a single missile, can shut down the capital's aviation network. That asymmetry is devastating.